Okay, hello, welcome to a rare Friday afternoon discussion for the Steel Center. These are normally on Wednesday afternoon, although I've been told there was a time where they were on Friday. So
for like 30 years.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
for those of you who are like, maybe you want to be in the back, and that's totally fine. But there are chairs
that's like
here.
there's a
You
lot
want to like sit on the floor, even feel come closer. With 3 chairs at least.
Yeah.
What do you want to do it?
Good job.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce Rebecca. Some of you guys have met her, maybe had a class with her, maybe heard her speak last night. So some of I'm just going to read her biography, but we have been so honored to have Rebecca Clarren here for the past 48 hours, I guess. And she's just nestled herself into the campus. I mean, I love the way that you've made connections with students and professors, and so we can invite her to be on faculty. So Rebecca's a journalist. She's written about the American West for over 2 decades. Her journalism has won the Hillman Prize for magazine journalism, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, and 10 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, and Indian Country Today. Her debut novel, Kicked Down, which is from Skyhorse Press, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize. And her most recent book, The Cost of Free Land, which we'll talk about today, won the 2021, here it is right there in the flesh, 2021 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. She lives with her husband and 2 children in Portland, Oregon. And she has just told me that her 13-year-old son is making his or has already made his theatrical debut, but he's in a play tomorrow. So she's leaving us tomorrow morning to go and see her son perform in Once Upon a Mattress. Yes. So we thank you, and we are wishing you well tomorrow as you make your journey home for a very important performance.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful to get to know some of you and to listen to your fantastic questions. And I'm so glad you're all here with us today. I see some faces who I have not seen. So for those of you who absolutely have no idea what my book is about, I'm going to probably repeat a few little things that some of you have heard already. So this book, The Cost of Free Land, it's what I think of as an entangled history. And it's this entangled history of my Jewish homesteading ancestors on the South Dakota prairie who got free land from the federal government, land that really paved their way to the middle class and beyond, and their Lakota neighbors whose land, that piece of land that becomes my family's land, that had been by federal treaty, the highest law of the land, that had been reserved, would be Lakota land forever. And the story of this book is told in the specifics of my family, the Sinnekins, who had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, who all became homesteaders on the South Dakota prairie. And the Whiteville family, there's a lot of photographs, or there was one photograph of my ancestor posing with Joseph Whiteville, who was a Minnekoju Lakota chief. And his oldest living descendant is now retired, but he was a very beloved Lakota teacher and coach, and loves history, loves Hemingway, and was very, when I met him, he said, I'm so excited about this project, and I really couldn't have done the book in the way that I ended up doing it without his support and help. So many conversations. He's a very long talker, and he gave me a lot of ideas that I wouldn't have had otherwise. The book and sort of how to go about doing this book, because you can have a good idea for a book, but then how are you going to write that idea? That's actually just as hard to figure out as what you're going to write about, in my opinion. And early on, before I wrote this book, I had been hired to write a series of stories about Native America that ran in Indian Country Today in The Nation magazine. And one of those stories was a profile of Judge Addie Avenatti. She's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation. She's also a state Superior Court Justice in California. And I wrote a profile about her for these publications because the way she runs her courtroom is becoming a model for non-Indigenous judges and Indigenous judges all over the country. She's very compassionate, and she says, I don't do restorative justice, I do traditional justice. I try and figure out, how did the Yurok do justice before what she calls cultural interruption, before we lost our traditions? And a judge in Michigan once told me, he said, most of our courts in America, they're about getting even. Judge Abby's court is about getting well. And she said to me, when I first met her, and this was just like an inkling of a project, and I bravely eventually we had a 7-hour drive together on this part of this reporting trip, and towards the end I told her about this idea I had, and she said, if you're gonna write this history, you should really grapple with it. Like, how are you going to respond to what you learn, and what are you going to do about it? She said, we know that justice works best when done in a cultural context, because it just means more, it resonates with people more. And she said, so you're Jewish, what do the Jews say about how to respond to a harm, even when you didn't directly commit, but one you've benefited from? And that guidance led me to approach my rabbi at my synagogue in Portland, Rabbi Benjamin Barnett, and because I had no idea how to study these ancient books. I had had a bat mitzvah. I do Shabbat regularly with my family. It's not like I'm not culturally a practitioner of Judaism, but to study our ancient texts, I really didn't know what to do. I'd never done that before. But my rabbi, I'm very grateful, said, this is the kind of learning that will benefit our whole community. And so he agreed to give me his time, and we met regularly for 3 years. And we did a practice called Hevruta, which is a traditional form of study in pairs. And we studied ancient Jewish texts, the Torah, the Talmud, for places in the text that look at atonement, repair, repentance, as trying to have guideposts for how we in America should respond or can respond to this issue of native land dispossession. And I just wanted to share with you all one of the teachings that I write about in the book. There is, in Deuteronomy, there is this story of, does everyone know what Deuteronomy is? It's one of the books of the Torah, which is the Jewish Bible. And in Deuteronomy, there's this discussion of what are you supposed to do if it's discovered that a dead body has been found in the middle of the road. And you can't figure out who did the murdering. And this was pre-Israelite communities. And what they did is they would measure, the communities nearest to the corpse would measure their distance from the body. And whatever community found themselves closer would take responsibility for not only burying the body, but doing a ritual that had serious economic cost to those communities to cleanse the area of the pollution of the sin of murder. And Toba Spitzer, who's a Reconstructionist rabbi on the East Coast, she has a really wonderful sermon she wrote about this Torah portion. And she says, this teaches us that, first of all, sin has communal impact. It impacts all of us, no matter if you've actually created the harm or not. But that we also, as communities, can take collective responsibility for that harm, and that we should. Because if you don't, if there's an impact to us all. And she says in this drudge, is what it's called, the sermon, she says, how can we all measure our own distance from the original sins of America, which are the enslaving of Black people and others, and the stealing and taking and dispossession of native land. And I thought about this question a lot when I was working on this project, because how do I measure? I mean, in some ways, the whole book is me measuring my own distance, right, from how the Homestead Act gave my family land that was taken from the Lakota Nation. And so my question for today is, like, how do we all find ourselves in this story of native land dispossession? How can we all measure our distance? And we only have an hour, so I don't think we're going to figure it out today exactly, but I will share, I have some questions I have a little bit more to share, and then I want to we're going to try and do a Ruta. We're going to split into pairs of 2, maybe 3 if you want. And I have on these, you can hand out these, we'll pass around these sheets. And the idea is you guys will sit and you'll sort of face each other and you'll ask each other the questions. And I think for Ruta, importantly, is like witnessing one another. So give each other a lot of space to talk and don't interrupt one another if possible. And then after we do this, we're going to come back and share. And if you have questions, we're going to talk about them. But before I let you go off to do your own Ruta, a couple of things to say. This is one thing I may have mentioned last night. I know I mentioned at some point, is that this idea of sin is a very, to me, heavy word. Like I hear that I've sinned and I immediately feel sort of a lot of shame. And Rabbi Benjamin taught me that in Hebrew, the term that gets translated as sin, it actually is the word hate, which comes from an archery term, which simply means to have missed the mark, just miss the mark, which feels a lot softer. Like we're all human, we're all going to miss the mark sometime. So how do we take responsibility for missing the mark and then move forward? And so as you're thinking about that, I just want you to keep that in mind. And then I guess I just want to share that from the way I'm thinking about how to, as a broader context for us all here at the outset of this conversation, as a descendant of homesteaders, I feel like my distance to the harm of land dispossession of Native people, it's a lot closer than someone whose family arrived here on slave ships or who maybe came to America in the last year. But no matter who you are, if you are living in this country and you are not Indigenous, you are benefiting from the taking of Native land. It is the breaking of trees is the foundation of our highway systems, the commercial agriculture that we all eat and use for cheap, relatively cheap. That is based on the taking and the flooding of native land. So much of our electricity, especially in the West, I actually don't know the history here as well, comes from dams, hydroelectric dams that flooded Indigenous communities in order to create electricity that I use in my house to turn on my computer. There are so many schools that are land grant schools. Does anyone know what a land grant is? They were created under Lincoln by the Merrill Act, and they were literally like basically as good as stolen. Often pennies were given to Native nations for their land, and then those pieces of land were the basis of either the universities were built on those pieces of land, or they were leased, and the money of those leases was used to endow the universities. And most land grants are a lot more affordable as tuition for people because of the way that they were started. And some of these universities, like Cornell, are having a lot of, and University of South Dakota, are thinking a lot about how do we attend to that history, and a lot of them are not. People are really interested in this piece of this history. High Country News did an incredible award-winning series about that, and you can find it actually online or in, oh, and we should have that too. So we're going to look at these questions, but also if you want to look when you meet in your small groups, this is called Resources for Further Research. It's in the back of my book for free, but it's also available freely on my website. And this is not meant to be a definitive story, but it is meant to help you. These are resources that helped me. So I would just love if people have questions, if people are willing to share anything that came up for them in the conversation or anything that surprised you from the conversation, it would be wonderful to have this larger, to move our Havruta into this larger space. And if if questions came up, and if I or another one of the professors here can answer them, we've got a live audience.
Ellen, you don't want to sit next to me?
I know, right? I feel
Unbelievable.
very
Yeah,
weird.
yeah. It's all right.
She's been
I'm used to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah's brave.
Thank you for coming in closer. Anyone feel like sharing or have questions? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, but maybe like a point of discussion. But like
Great.
Evelyn and I were talking about question number 3, and is sin useful when considering history?
Great.
And
What did you tell me? What you decided? I'd like to know.
Well, we said that like
All this works once and for all.
the final answer is that there's not but
Not final, not final.
no, like
Yeah.
we ultimately felt that it was like it's complex and that like because there's a lot of malleability in what sin is and
Mhm.
how that obviously the question itself kind of gets us thinking about different interpretations of sin.
Mhm.
And so like certainly we felt it wasn't the only useful way to look at history, and that like the interpretation of missing the mark can be really helpful, but outside of that it came so it felt too complex to put an answer to.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
I agree with you. I think that like when you look at history, you kind of have to look at all of it. And sin can kind of restricts it a little bit.
Like it's judging it.
Yeah, it's hard to define what is good and bad in the context of the time that this was occurring. These things are wrong, and it should be said as so. But I feel like using what you might, because sin is kind of like it's definitive, but some people feel a different way about different sins, and it becomes a discussion. So it's hard to be objective, I feel.
Yeah, there's a line in my book where I write like this book, like all books, is speaks more to the contemporary moment than to the past.
Yeah.
Because this is where we are. This is who we are. This is why we're writing and thinking about it now. Like to think that we can have some like objective idea that is sustained. To me, it doesn't. I don't believe that. So you, there was a person behind you, and then you, please.
I guess in terms of that, like being a history major,
Mhm.
this word sin with the meaning like miss the mark, I think for me it's very useful because it kind of relates to what you said earlier, where like a book writes a book basically, where you
Books
use
are
it-
built on
yeah,
other
book-
books. Yeah.
because like maybe one historian could sin or miss the mark of one thing, but this other historian has something else to say.
Mm.
So then you decide to write a book that kind of tells the truth about both of the colliding
Yes.
aspects. So I thought that the sin is useful when considering history, just because of that. Butting heads of two people, and then you make your own story or narrative of it based on
Mhm.
evidence from the two books. So
I love that. Judge Abby early on was said to me, like, in a murder trial, you get eyewitnesses. And all of them were there. They all saw the thing happen. They all have different versions of what happened. And she said to me, your job is to go out and collect as many strands of that truth as you can, and then write them and try to write them together. So, there's more. I hope more people will write books, and my book might be just a tiny strand and much bigger story, a new one. Please, you to share.
So for question 2 about like measuring our own distance, I really liked it because it's more of a reflective question rather than what does everybody else think and how do they feel about it, because I can't assume that at all, but I can definitely like tell you how I feel about it. And I think this question like specifically being like, because we've all heard the terms like we've stolen the natives' land, like we've benefited over it, or like our country's built on slavery, we've benefited over it. But I think when you think more personally, like the area I live in, the school I go to, how I travel, like how am I benefiting from the like unfairness of other people in the past, just like really makes you reflect on how like history is all around us and not just like in a bigger context of just America.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. I write in the back of the book about how the rabbi and I, after we'd done Havruta for several years, we wanted to extend the conversation to our community. So we offered a free class for a synagogue, and like 50 people took it. It was over Zoom. It was maybe during the pandemic. And it was all these like incredibly kind, caring people who were showing up for a class, over Zoom. But almost all of them were like, this is a societal issue. This has nothing to do with me. And the rabbi just kept gently over and over again saying, like, how do you find yourself here? Find yourself on the page. How do you find yourself in the story? And by the end of the class, it definitely felt like people really were alive to the ways. And that's what I hope these resources help people to do, is to sort of like see their connections, to measure their distance. So, thank you for sharing.
I was telling my group that a religious studies professor and 2 philosophy students. We got caught on number 3 for a long time. But I have this very like the Christian tradition of original sin is pretty demoralizing, right? That like there's nothing you can do to get out of this state. This is your born inherent state. And I don't love it. There's something residual about it that keeps coming back to me that actually feels kind of powerful, that like these like sin as residue sort of builds up over time. And I think with history in particular, it does feel kind of right? They were like sort of living in the residue. But I also don't like it.
So that like unattended to harms compound.
Yeah, yeah. Someone talks about it as residue, and I can't remember who it is.
What do you all think about, did anyone get to number 4? I think there's been some, like, there was a lot of like energy around this question for me and for others as I was interviewing them, of like, what can we still, do we have to, who's bad now? Like, I was in North Dakota at an event, and this old timers, you could tell he was taking this so seriously. and that he'd never thought of these things before. He was a rancher. His family had gotten a homestead, and he was like, so now do I have to be upset with my grandfather? Like, are we bad? And I find that really, I have compassion for him. And I quickly said, absolutely not. Like, no, that's not what I'm here to talk about and to say. But I'm curious if anyone kind of thought or grappled a little with this idea of like, what happens to our sense of ourselves as Americans? Can patriotism coexist with revisiting and expunging myths about our country? Yeah.
I think that it has so much to do with patriotism once you admit your fault. You know, if you try to live this, where you have this image that everything's perfect on the inside, and that this house is so nice, perfect white, got the good windows, everything's great. You know, there's gonna be a crack in there, and if you admit that crack and you say, "Hey, we need some help. We gotta fix this. We gotta get some reparations about this, and it'll get fixed." And you can't just hide it away, because then house falls down.
Beautiful. Love that. Yeah.
I was thinking how connected it is to the question, like, I hadn't thought about it before, but the question of how we handle things in the present, how connected it is to the idea of sin. And I was thinking of this idea of compassion. And I often think that if we can't have compassion for ourselves, it's very hard to have compassion for other people. And so I was thinking that the person standing up, how can you have to begin with yourself and accepting the things that you've done before you can go on and move to others. And to me, that really relates, at least my sense culturally, to the concepts of sin that we hold, what we can do about that.
That's interesting. Do you want to share, not to put you on the spot, but there is this Jewish concept of tshuva, which I was talking a little bit about last night after someone in the audience asked about it. Tshuva is an important idea in Judaism. It gets translated as repair, but it really means return. And my rabbi talks about it as returning to the inherent goodness of your nature. And it's built into it's at the daily prayer level. Lots of cycles of Judaism, if you're practicing it fully, are asking you to think about the way you've harmed and return to the inherent goodness of your nature and figure out how to repair and to keep coming back to it. And I feel like that daily cycle idea of it is a reminder, just inherent in the fact that it's there to say, you've clearly made a mistake you've clearly done something that needs some repair in the last day. So here we are, let's think about it. And I don't think this is always how it goes, but I like the idea that, again, it's a softening, there's a compassion, there's sort of a container for it, instead of something to run away from and to ignore. Yeah.
Also a question for thinking about like the extent of how proud I should be. We instantly started talking about a president being good or bad, and I was like, why are we talking about the binary of good or bad? Because if you social psych, we learned with racism that a lot of people take it, you're racist, you're bad, you're not racist, you're good. But you actually learn that racism is kind of built into us systemically.
Totally.
And I think like the efforts of us learning to not be racist and how to like individuate people more is like the progress of being a good person rather than I'm not racist, so I'm a good person. So that's what I thought about history is like the progress we make is what was good, and that's why I'm proud of it. But I'm definitely not proud of like you look at this one instant in history, I'm like, no, but the changes that we made was better.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for